Welcome to Practical Changemakers, a carbon positive story. I'd like to acknowledge that we're broadcasting to you today on Wajak Noongar Boodja and to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. My name is Louise and I'm the CEO of Carbon Positive Australia. Our mission is to empower and encourage everyone in Australia to take action that revitalises and improves the health of landscapes and communities. We do this via our carefully selected Australian tree planting projects and by providing inspiring education programs. We plant trees to offset carbon emissions, connect communities and encourage everyone to make climate healthy choices that go beyond being carbon neutral. Our planting benefits nature, community and the wider well-being of our regions. Through our work, we get to talk to and spend time with people who are working for the health of our environment every day. These practical change makers and leaders don't often make the headlines, but the work that they do is vital in our changing world. It's my pleasure to introduce some of them to you and for you to hear more about their work, to be inspired and to find out ways you can also become a practical change maker. My guests today are Niaal Holder. Niaal is Digital Director at Anthology, a community of globally experienced creatives, strategists and technologists, very fine people too, brought together by a shared passion to create a positive impact on the world. A digital native with over 20 years experience in interface design, web development and user experience, Niaal has worked for some of Perth's foremost web agencies and businesses and speaks regularly at industry events and universities. His work focuses on the journey of web and app users, translating complex tools and information into accessible, engaging and human-friendly experiences. Jess is Carbon Positive Australia's Commercial and Carbon Project Coordinator. She's responsible for managing the logistics of our carbon planting projects, as well as developing and maintaining our online and Excel-based calculators. Jess holds qualifications in finance and accounting and has experience in non-financial assurance, sustainability reporting and carbon life cycle analysis. Growing up in the WA Wheatbelt, she's passionate about the role nature can play in combating climate change and raising awareness about the importance of preserving and restoring Australia's natural resources. Jess played a major role in the development of the personal carbon footprint calculator, contributing to design, data collection and analysis, copywriting and user acceptance testing aspects. A very big welcome and warm welcome to you both.
Thanks, Louise.
Thank you.
Today we're talking about carbon calculation. So in 2020, Carbon Positive Australia was supported by LotteryWest to build a personal carbon calculator alongside the design team from Anthology, a local Perth creative agency. Both Niaal and Jess were instrumental in the creation of the personal carbon calculator. I'd love to find out a little bit more about you both as individuals and how you got involved in the project.
Absolutely. Well, I'll go first. So I'm Jess. Pleasure to be here, Louise.
Thank you, Jess.
And I could talk about the calculator all day, so we're going to struggle to keep this to half an hour, I think. But I guess I came into this project maybe a couple of weeks after kickoff, and I'd had some experience in life cycle carbon analysis, so auditing other organisations' carbon footprints to make sure that the figures that they were reporting to their stakeholders were correct. So it was kind of natural that I got on board, and it was certainly an eye-opening experience, mainly from the tech side of just learning about how complicated it is to integrate a tool like this into an existing platform, but also how to make something that's user-friendly. So,
and you've certainly created something which is complex but so simple.
Yes, we hope so.
Niaal.
Yes, so I'm Niaal. I'm the digital director at Anthology, and how I found myself in this project. This has always been one of those things that falls in my sweet spot for my experience. I've been working in the web for the past 21 odd years, and I tend towards projects that have a lot of a problem-solving component to them, or like how to make complex things simple for people to use. And I remember a point when this project came up at Anthology where we had a couple of new projects on the go, and looking at the brief for each of them, this had my name written all over it. So while Anthology decided to do the work, I think it was also very much up for grabs for me to step in and get my hands all over it. So exactly the sort of challenge that we really like to solve, and it turned out to be exactly exactly that sort of project. So it was really good fun.
And I think that's what it was, wasn't it? It was a huge sort of problem-solving puzzle that we kind of had to go through. And, you know, prior to that, it was on an Excel spreadsheet, wasn't it? All of our calculator. We had a sort of an online version, but it was sort of supported by, like a background Excel. So why was it important to kind of update and have this new online tool? Jess, what were we planning to sort of get out of that, do you think?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think we really just wanted to make it a more friendly user experience, but there was also the need to have some educational components to it. And so in the new calculator, there are tips and hints on how you can reduce your footprint, as well as like really tailored insights into your personal footprint. So it was really just making it a better user experience in the hope that more people calculated their footprint and reduced their footprint. So I think something that a lot of people don't know is that Australian households are responsible for around 20% of Australia's total greenhouse gas emissions. So there are lots of small changes that we can all make in our daily activities, and they don't have to be big changes, but there are changes that we can make that will help to reduce our total emissions.
Yeah, and I think, you know, when we're talking about sort of problem solving and getting this online tool, that user experience was really forefront, wasn't it, Niaal, in ensuring that people would actually want to use it. Yeah,
and I think that's about the point where I can remember coming in on the project was being introduced to the spreadsheets, which was a fantastic way to capture the information, but then just by virtue of its existence represented a unique problem. It's like, how do we take this and turn it into something that someone could pick up and use and sit down and complete in one sitting, and not have to run away and do the heavy lifting and the due diligence that you see so often in other similar tools online. I've used other tools. I've worked on other tools where you spend so much time rifling through old bills and looking for documents and receipts and tracking back to things. But we took the unique angle with this one of saying, how do we turn that into something that someone could comfortably engage with and actually enjoy doing? And I think that was a really unique way to look at it, especially considering where we started.
Yeah, because I think the last thing we wanted was for people to sort of take that idea that it was like doing your tax return, you know, something you had to do at the end of the year, find all the bills, you know, wanted something that was really user friendly and that people wanted to use because they would get more from it as well in terms of the education. And I think, you know, what's actually produced, I hope sort of listeners will go on and have a look afterwards. It definitely shows that you solve these problems. But I know, and I think these insights are really important. What kind of challenges did you have? Because it was challenging, wasn't it? This wasn't, you know, I think people can look at the end product and think, oh, well, that looks, you know, reasonably simple. But actually, we know from behind the scenes, it wasn't. So, yeah, I'd love to hear from you both kind of, what were those challenges?
Yes.
The knowing glances back and forth.
Yeah, absolutely. It's finding where to start. So I guess from a calculation perspective, it's finding reputable sources and reputable data is a real challenge because the government does release emissions factors, but only for some aspects of the footprint. So we had to find other sources that we could rely on that we were comfortable in using. And then it's using that data in a way that makes sense to the end user. So, for example, Niaal, you might want to, that's really your field is presenting the questions in a way that people understand.
Yeah, so from my side coming in on this project, because I admittedly was a bit of a Luddite on the subject and have since used our own tool to calculate my own footprint, and it was enlightening. But coming in with that mindset, there's an approach I like to take with a lot of these projects where there's a period before I'm properly embedded in a project as a UX person where I'm ignorant, and that's actually a very useful tool for something like this to come in on a subject like to pluck one out of the air, like how to handle and calculate your waste, the impact of your waste.
Oh, waste. Yes, we all remember waste.
Oh, absolutely. It's forever burned in our minds and hearts. It's an interesting one because I came in thinking I knew everything there was to know about waste and how hard could it be to determine what my impact was, only to discover the various dimensions and ins and outs and obscure metrics that go into calculating waste. And so that by itself is a unique challenge because there's a complicated component to tracking that, and it's not in a human-friendly format more often than not. It's actually in a calculator-friendly format. So for the purposes of calculating your footprint, those figures and those metrics are straightforward and the formulae are probably very clear.
Mm-hmm.
But from the human's perspective, the person who sits down to actually decide how much they've contributed, having to decide how many kilograms of waste are in the bin in my bathroom is not something that we've ever really gone and done. Like you wouldn't expect someone to weigh their bin.
No. And yet all the calculators that we came across said that, didn't they? You know, how much kilograms of waste you?
Exactly.
I wouldn't have had a clue. No.
So like taking that approach and saying, what does your garden variety person have coming into this? What expectations and assumptions do they have? How do we take this complicated approach and turn it into something that gets us to the same results in that rough area, that gives us that accuracy that we want for a tool like this, but also does it in such a fashion that someone doesn't have to sit there scratching their heads and potentially drop away from using the tool. So it's an interesting one on that side. And then on the other side, we have challenges like how to calculate something like air travel or road travel. Again, the metrics are about how do we calculate that with some degree of certainty. The spreadsheet, I think in its original format, Jess had literally listing every airport that you've flown to and from to in order to calculate the kilometers distance traveled, the class that you flew, the number of people that were on the flights. And it became like by itself, it's a very accurate tool, but as an itinerary planner at that point, it's just so laborious to sit down. If you imagine someone, a heavy business traveler pre-COVID, obviously, they'll be traveling every second week, air travel. And that sort of itinerary planner is probably a deal breaker from a user experience point of view. So it's a really interesting challenge there. But then taking that view and saying, can we make something work for that person as well as the person who's flown once or rarely flown and isn't that kind of person? So trying to broaden that spectrum and build something for everybody on top of how complex these questions are is a really interesting challenge.
And I like the way actually that we ended up doing that, because we ended up going with hours travel, didn't we? Because that was something that people could kind of have in their mind. You generally, especially if you've done a long haul flight, you remember how many hours you were on there. Yeah. But also, I mean, there was complication with that as well, wasn't there? Because obviously if you're doing a long haul flight, you're kind of perhaps going up and down a number of times. And so we had to look at the carbon calculator. Jess, do you want to talk a little bit more about that? Because that was quite an interesting one from my perspective.
Yeah, it is. So during takeoff and landing is the most carbon intense time of the flight. So we had to make some assumptions and apply that to the emissions factors to be able to present the calculation in that way. And I think that's where Niall and I had to compromise a lot. You know, he'd come up with this solution that was great from a user point of view. And in an ideal world, yes, that's how we would present it. But then I would kind of had to look at the data that we had available and say, well, I can't manipulate it in that way, or there's going to be too many assumptions, because part of the hardest part of this calculator really was finding that balance between accuracy and ease of use. Because the Excel tool is super, super accurate, but it is a bit more laborious and not everybody wants to sit there and enter all of their data. So it was finding a balance between the two things, and the waste and the air travel section were definitely
And I think you did that really well, actually. I think, you know, what you've ended up with is an example of how you can actually do that and produce the results. The results that you need. The other thing is this calculator is actually specific to Australia, isn't it? So do you want to talk a little bit more about that and how finding some of those assumptions for Australia wasn't as easy as kind of you might think?
Yeah, absolutely. So we've relied on the Australian government national emissions factors for the majority of the calculations, and also data from the Australian Bureau of Statistics wherever possible. And that's another thing I wanted to bring up is that there is the option throughout the calculator for those people who want to go through quickly to use averages. So we've taken averages from the ABS. There are assumptions that you have to make about, especially around the food and drink section, about where the food is coming from, because obviously the emissions intensity of a carrot coming from an hour away from your house as opposed to coming in on a plane from overseas is very different. So you just have to make some assumptions.
All carrots are not equal.
Exactly right. So that was definitely a challenge.
So I think, you know, one of the really key points of the calculator itself was to make an experience for people. So there were lots of, you know, did you know this fact? just tell us a little bit more about that, Niaal, and how you incorporated that into the whole sort of user experience to ensure that people actually got something more than just the calculator from it.
That I think was the equally important challenge setting out. Obviously, we had the very, the empirical side of how do we turn these calculations into something that's accessible, but also coming at it from the perspective of this being an opportunity. Like, if we can engage people to use the platform, we have an opportunity to do some fairly important and remarkable things here. So the challenge was to inform the user along the way, educate them about why the various steps have certain impacts. I think one of the most enlightening things for me in actually using the tool was coming to the end. At the end of the calculator, we have a results page that tells you how you're...
Oh yes, tell us more about that, because that's quite interesting. I love that bit of it.
It's a really, I think this is the real kind of the coup de grace of the calculator is this closing page and what it affords you to go and do as a user. It's not just here's your score and see you later. It's a breakdown not only of the individual sections and your various impacts, but it quite intelligently highlights areas where you're performing probably the least favorable for your outcome. So if you're a heavy traveler, it will highlight that and say you travel, this is an area where you could probably reduce your impact with some more conscientious planning. And in every other area that we have covered in the 6 major subject areas of the calculator, each of those areas has their own unique kind of journey of information that we provide along the way. So we'll inform the user about waste and how solar energy is factored into your electricity calculations. So there's opportunities along the way to signpost and educate people at the specific points of impact, as well as this closing page where these recommendations, this breakdown kind of drives it home at that point. I think for me, that's the part that excites me the most, because it exposed to me when I got to the end, I was, feeling pretty big for my boots at that point, going, I know our house doesn't use air conditioning. We don't have heaters. And it's, we took it as a challenge to say, how good are we? And we thought we were pretty good until we did I think it was the food.
That was what tripped me up as well, actually.
It was huge. Yeah. And it wasn't until I got to that page using the tool that I had helped build, was still surprised by what it had put in front of me. And that was actually, a moment where I'm like, this is a tool for genuine impact. This is going to educate people. It's not just about competing for high scores or low scores in this case, but telling people why these numbers matter and what areas they can work on to improve things. So taking opportunities basically from the very start to show people how they're progressing with their various activities and habits. And then wrapping it all up in this package at the end and providing them with next steps and actions that they can take. So important. And I think that's a good use of that experience. It's one thing to turn it into an engaging experience and have it, people share it on Facebook and then they move along. But to have something like that compels people to want to learn more, understand where they're impacting and come back and use it again. I think that's probably one of the most important details of the calculator.
And come back and use it again is really important, because actually within the calculator, you can create an account, can't you? So you can actually look at your because for those who aren't aware, your carbon calculation is retrospective. So you're always doing it about the past. And then you're recalculating again, seeing whether you've improved, things have got worse or whatever. So actually having that access to an account is something that I don't think is very, offered on many calculators for you to be able to do. So,
yeah. And it's having a baseline to compare to, because I was the same. I did my calculation for my partner and I, and we're relatively eco-conscious people, but I was really shocked by the output. And I hate to think what our result would have been had we been flying like we did pre-COVID. Yeah. So I think most people that do the calculator are surprised by their results, but we've chosen certain aspects to focus on for the next year, and it's a bit of an internal competition now.
And that's it, isn't it? Because you've got the results page, you can actually go, look, you'd have to eat that whole apple, do you? You can just kind of go, I'm just going to do this bit this year and work on that bit. And overall, though, I was very surprised, by our averages. As an Australian, very surprised by the averages, and also surprised by what I actually have to get to in order to meet some of the targets that have been set.
Yeah, absolutely. So the average for an Australian household footprint for a year is anywhere between 15 and 20 tonnes of carbon dioxide equivalent. That can vary significantly based on where you live and your lifestyle. And if you fly a lot, that could be more than 30 tonnes a year.
Wow.
according to the UN, if we want to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees by 2050, we need to limit per person emissions to 2 tonnes per year. So if you live in a house with 2 people, that's 4 tonnes a year.
That's incredible, isn't it?
Mm.
And I think that's part of the education process of the calculator, isn't it? I think it shows us actually how much work we've got to do.
Yeah.
You know, as a society and as individuals as well. So yeah, for me, I think the results page and that final bit, I think you're right now. That is the key page, isn't it? In the whole the whole calculator.
It's an interesting little side habit I've seen people like. We watch closely when people use the tools, particularly when you think you're done with the tool. That's like we discover things along the way watching how people use the tools. And one of the I guess the surprises of how people are using it as an education tool, as I saw when our office was filling it out, individuals were filling out their impact, was watching people put values in, get to the results page, see the breakdown, and then try and go back and change their numbers to bring that number down. So they were almost trying to figure out like how can I circumvent this? But what you are quietly educating them to do at that point is be aware of where the heaviest impact is. So even innately, seeing how people use this tool, it's a great way to interrogate how they're behaving, even if they're trying to cheat the system. You can't.
No, that's it. You can't. You just have to kind of move ahead, don't you?
Yeah.
And look at the results and then see kind of where you're heading. Jess, I'd love for you to maybe give, some of our listeners some ideas about things that they can actually do that are listening to us today. What are some ways that we can think about our footprint and how how we can reduce it?
Absolutely. And I think there's a bit of a misconception that only people with a lot of money can make an impact, because and that's not true. Not everyone can afford to buy a Tesla or put solar panels on their roof, and that's not what you necessarily need to do to have a big impact. So some of the easier impacts or changes that you can make are around using public transport. It's not all the time, but think about it before you get in the car. Could I get a bus? Could I get a train?
Yeah, because it's quite difficult in parts of WA, isn't it? Let's be honest, they're big distances to cover. So, yeah.
Also, electric bikes have come down a lot in price, and you can cover a lot further distance on an electric bike that you can on a traditional push bike.
Love bikes. Yep, great idea.
Yeah, and especially in major cities, they're always putting in more bike paths as it is becoming more common. Electricity is a great way to not only reduce your carbon footprint but also save money. So it's easy things like using the eco setting on your washing machine and your dishwasher, using a power board that you can flick off all your appliances at once because they do drain energy while they're on standby mode. Making sure your house has good insulation and draft proofing, the cracks between the windows.
Little sausage dogs you put on your door, I remember those.
They're a bit granny, but they really work. And stuff like that will just reduce the amount that you need to use your aircon or your heater. A big one and an easy one is buying local and fresh produce. So one of the biggest impacts in terms of your food carbon footprint is buying things that are coming from a close distance to you, the carrots, for example. So rather than buying asparagus that's been flown in from Mexico because that's had to travel on a plane, it's had to be refrigerated for that period, it's then had to get to the shop, and then it's had to get to your house. If you're buying local produce from a farmer's market, or even just at Coles looking at the signs, because they do tell you, they say produce of Australia.
I've become a label reader because that was my biggest kind of personal footprint, and now I'm where's this come from? Where's this come from? And trying to shop at local sort of farmers markets and finding out where my food's actually from has been a real eye-opener for me, I must admit.
Yeah. And the other one is just encouraging other people to know their number as well. So it's not a competition, but it's a fun competition to know that you're all making changes and comparing that. And then offsetting your footprint is another one which you might want to talk to a bit more.
Yeah, so part of the calculator allows you to also do offsetting. So if you've produced a ton of carbon, you can basically offset that ton of carbon with the equivalent with Carbon Positive Australia, you can plant trees. So the way that we offset is through removing carbon by our tree planting projects. And we have some amazing planting projects across Western Australia and also in New South Wales that are measured and monitored. And we can tell you exactly how much carbon those trees are likely to sequester over their life cycle. So there's always going to be that element that, yes, you possibly can't remove through education. And then, you might want to consider offsetting that amount. And you can do that very easily through the carbon calculator, through, as part of your journey. You can then go and do your offsetting, which, I did, I must admit, for myself this year, because I knew there were elements that, I couldn't remove. But I think the fun of it is actually the removal bit, isn't it? It's the kind of, reducing what you're actually doing and really sort of doing that almost like in-depth look at your lifestyle and thinking, where can I change? And I'm really excited actually to go back and do my calculation again next year, because I know that I have taken certain steps, and I'm really hoping that I don't think I'm going to be down to 2 by any means. I have to put my hands up to that, but I think I'm excited to kind of see, how well have I done in comparison to the previous year.
I look at the like my partner and I sat down to use the tool, and when we realized that the food section was our far and away our heaviest impact area, like we were saying before, people going back to see how they can try and change the numbers, it's interesting to look at even something as simple as the difference between an omnivorous diet and a vegan diet and a vegetarian diet, how that breaks down. And then you can start to kind of draw assumptions around where that little bit of impact is. And while I can't say that we're switching to a vegan diet necessarily, we can at least be more conscious of and plan for the sorts of things that we buy, knowing that when you look at individual areas of the calculator and the different types of foods that you can buy, how it impacts can inform the decisions when you're wandering shopping aisles, as it has with us. So it's been really fantastic for that. And it's the tool that really showed us that, not necessarily, be sitting there and understanding the breakdowns of these things. And it's kind of shameful to admit, but I have a feeling that a lot of people will be in that position where it's like, I don't have the time to go away and do the research myself to learn all of these little ins and outs for these things. But having it compartmentalized like this and brought to the fore with a little score sheet at the end, a little
it
report
makes it
card.
feel more personal, because people can tell you that you should catch the bus, but until you've really done your own calculation and looked at how your car use is contributing to your footprint, you're less inclined to make the change, I think.
And also, I mean, you are helped in the shopping because you've got the Buy West logos as well. So you can see that, your food perhaps hasn't had to travel so far. Although, of course, we all know that things aren't always that simple. But, we can it's just taking the time, isn't it, to do a little bit of planning sometimes, really. And if you've got that awareness, you're more likely to do the planning. Whereas if you haven't, then, you're just going to carry on really doing what you've always done. Yeah, I think that's true of everybody. So we've talked a lot about sort of, what people can do and how they can actually look at their carbon footprint. I suppose I'd just like to kind of finish really with just kind of on a personal level. I know you've talked about your own carbon footprint, but on a personal level, what you got out of the project, because I think, when you do these kind of big projects, they're hard. You go right down into it, don't you, when you're actually doing a big project like this? And sometimes they can seem like there's no end to it. We have kind of we're almost at the end. There's always those few little tiny bits, but we're pretty much almost at the end. How the project's actually impacted you on a personal level, and whether you did enjoy it or whether you do it again, I suppose, is the question. Would you do this again?
Yeah, well, we were talking about this earlier and just saying that it was a really rare project in terms of how we worked together, because it was so integrated between the work that Anthology were doing and the work that we were doing on our side, that I had, Kate and Niaal on speed dial, and we were going back and forth every day. So I think it was a really good lesson in how effective collaboration can work, and how, that it really does work when you communicate well with people. I personally got a huge insight into the tech landscape, and that's a challenge that we didn't really touch on earlier, is how complicated a website and integrating an e-commerce site with a tool like this can be, and the ins and outs of that. So personally, I learned a lot. But it was, yes, I would do it again.
Oh,
that's the answer. Is the answer to your question.
Long story short, I would do the same. I really enjoyed this project, and it really suited both the way that I work selfishly and the way that Anthology likes to work as well. We're very big on with our projects dropping in and working like we're part of the team for the people that we work with, and that doesn't always work out. But with Carbon Positive, it was effortless in that respect. I remember countless meetings where both of our teams would meet at the boardroom table and we'd hash out some big problems. And I could see Jess across the table with, the furrowed brow that I was probably pushing as well. And what that meant was, this meeting is important and we'll have this conversation, but afterwards there's going to be a phone call, and I'd like duck out in the back alleyway and talk to Jess like, right, how are we going to tackle this?
Can we really do this?
Can we actually do this? And there were many, many phone calls along that line. And I really appreciate that sort of collaboration. Oftentimes, a client will look at a relationship like this and treat the agency like a black box. Rightly or wrongly, you can come to a good result that way. But being able to feel like you're a single team working on the project is just so valuable. And for something like this, where the output is so important, like that on a personal note is really important to me. I like to know that what I'm doing is being used for good, and this is 100% good.
Yeah, and look, we were so fortunate as well to be supported by Anthology, not just in terms of the work they did, but with some financial support as well towards the calculator. So we're deeply grateful to them, and deeply grateful as well to LotteryWest, who saw the potential benefits of this project and supported it through our Carbon Care project. I hope that everyone who's listened today has had a little bit of an insight, a little bit of a background. Oh, before I finish that, actually, I really want to thank we had some test users, didn't we, that came in and helped us to sort of iron out some of the blips early on, and then came back and kind of did it all again when it was sort of getting near to completion. So a big thank you to them as well. They were invested from the start. There are some people, I'm not sure if everyone realises this, but Carbon Positive Australia was one of the very first carbon calculators in Australia. And we've got some really dedicated people that have kind of been using our carbon calculator for many years, and they really stepped in and helped us to create this and completed surveys and really
and it
helped.
Was a huge help, because it's one of those things that when you're so close to something, sometimes you can't see the really obvious issue with it. And there were changes that were made because of those users.
So a big thank you to them. If you want to find out more about Anthology, where can they find you, Niall, if you're looking for a great creative agency?
So you can hit We Are Anthology. That's with an IE on the end, WeAreAnthologie.com. And there are contact details on the website to get in touch with us. You can have a look at our work very soon. A new website launching should have all you need to know about us and what we do.
That's brilliant. And if you're interested and you've been inspired by this and you want to now go and calculate your footprint, you can find the calculation at carbonpositiveaustralia.org.au. Go and find us, find out more. Thank you so much to both of you. Thank you, Niall. Thank you, Jess.
Thank you.
Really enjoyed speaking today.